Zeftar had witnessed the fall of 17 civilizations in his 3,000 years as a combat analyst for the Galactic Observation Council. He had seen species torn apart by their own violent nature, watched empires crumble under the weight of their ambitions, and documented the final gasps of races too proud to accept their limitations. But nothing had prepared him for what he was about to witness on the small blue planet the humans called Earth. His tentacles trembled as he adjusted the viewing apparatus, the crystalline display showing the coordinates that had been transmitted across the galaxy in what the humans called their internet. The message had been simple, almost laughably primitive by galactic standards. To any who would challenge humanity's right to exist among the stars, we invite you to send your champions to face ours. Coordinates attached. Come and test your strength against Earth's finest. The audacity was breathtaking. Humanity had only achieved faster-than-light travel 6 months ago, stumbling into galactic society like a newborn taking its first steps. Most species required centuries to even understand the basic protocols of interstellar diplomacy. Yet here they were, issuing challenges to civilizations that had mastered the stars while their ancestors were still discovering fire. Zeftar's research had shown him that Earth was a death world, a planet so hostile that it regularly tried to kill its own inhabitants through natural disasters, predators, and environmental extremes that would destroy most galactic species in minutes. The fact that humans had not only survived, but thrived on such a world should have been warning enough. But the galaxy's established powers saw only primitives with crude technology and an inflated sense of their own importance. The response had been swift. 17 different civilizations had accepted the challenge, each sending their finest warriors to this remote system. Zeftar had been dispatched by the Council to document what they assumed would be humanity's inevitable humiliation and subsequent subjugation. It would serve as a useful lesson for other emerging species about knowing their place in the cosmic order. As a ship dropped out of hyperspace at the edge of the Sol system, Zeftar was struck by the sheer scale of the response. Massive dreadnoughts from the Kethvar Empire hung in space like metallic mountains, their hull-mounted weapons capable of cracking moons. The crystal ships of the Luminari gleamed with internal light, each one a work of art that could level continents with focused energy beams. Sleek vessels from the Void Hunters prowled the outer system like mechanical sharks, their stealth systems making them flicker in and out of visibility. The humans had designated a large asteroid in their belt as the meeting point. As Zeftar's ship approached, he could see the primitive human vessels, crude metal constructs that looked more like flying scrap yards than proper starships. Their technology was centuries behind anything else in the gathered fleet. The human vessels didn't even have proper energy shielding, relying instead on thick armor plating that made them look like flying tanks. The human commander's transmission crackled with interference as it reached the assembled fleet. The voice was calm, almost casual, despite facing odds that should have left any sane being cowering in terror. Welcome to our solar system. I'm Admiral Sarah Chun of Earth's First Fleet. Since you've all come such a long way to test yourselves against our champions, we've prepared something special. Each of you will face one of our representatives in single combat. The terms are simple: defeat our champion, and humanity will acknowledge your superiority. Defeat all our champions, and we'll submit to whatever terms you see fit. But if our champions win... The transmission paused, and Zeftar could almost hear the smile in the human's voice. Well, let's just say you might want to reconsider your opinions about Earth. The Kethvar representative, Warprime Thaklan, was the first to respond. His species stood 3 meters tall, with natural armor plating and strength that could crush steel. They had conquered half their galaxy through pure physical might. Human, your bravado amuses me. I will face your strongest warrior and show you what true strength means. Admiral Chin's response was immediate. Excellent. Our first champion is ready to meet you on the asteroid surface. Her name is Maria Santos, and she's looking forward to the challenge. Zeftar extended his sensory apparatus to maximum range as the two fighters prepared to meet. The Kethvar warrior was exactly what he expected, a mountain of muscle and bone encased in ceremonial combat armor that had been blessed by his species' war gods. His weapons were traditional, but effective. A massive war hammer that could shatter stone, and a personal energy shield that had deflected plasma cannons in previous conflicts. The human champion was underwhelming. Maria Santos appeared to be a standard human female, perhaps slightly taller than average, wearing what looked like a simple environmental suit with basic armor plating. Her only visible weapon was a metal staff about 2 meters long. Zeftar checked his instruments twice, certain there must be some mistake. Were the enhancement suits? The energy weapons? The technological advantages that might level the playing field? The asteroid surface had been prepared with a basic atmosphere generator, creating a bubble of breathable air around the designated combat zone. As the two fighters faced each other across the rocky terrain, the contrast was almost comical. Thaklan looked like a walking siege engine. Santos looked like she was going for a casual stroll. Is this some sort of joke? Thaklan's voice boomed across the battlefield. You send a fragile female with a stick to face the might of the Kethvar Empire? Santos simply smiled and took a ready stance with her staff. Maria Santos, Staff Sergeant, United States Marine Corps. Pleasure to meet you. Thaklan's laugh was like an earthquake. I will try to make your death quick, little human. Your bravery deserves that much respect. The Kethvar warrior charged with the force of an avalanche, his war hammer raised high. Santos didn't move until the last possible second, then flowed around his attack like water around a stone. The hammer struck the ground where she had been standing with enough force to crack the asteroid surface. Before Thaklan could recover, Santos' staff struck 3 precise points on his armor, 2 at joint connections and 1 at a sensor array. The Kethvar stumbled but recovered quickly, swinging his hammer in a wide arc that should have caught Santos across her midsection. Instead, she ducked under the swing and drove the butt of her staff into his knee joint. The impact rang like a bell, and Thaklan actually staggered. Zeftar watched in fascination as the pattern repeated. The human never stood and traded blows with her opponent. Instead, she moved constantly, striking at weak points with surgical precision. Each attack targeted joints, sensors, or weapon grips. She wasn't trying to overpower the Kethvar. She was dismantling him piece by piece. Stand still and fight. Thaklan roared, his attacks becoming wilder as frustration mounted. His hammer strikes could have felled trees, but they consistently hit empty air as Santos danced around him. I am fighting, Santos replied calmly, her staff cracking against his shield generator. Sparks flew as the device overloaded. You're just not very good at it. The insult struck home harder than any physical blow. Thaklan abandoned all technique and launched himself at Santos in a berserker rage. It was exactly what she had been waiting for. As the massive warrior threw himself forward, Santos stepped aside and used his own momentum to send him crashing into a boulder. Before he could recover, her staff was at his throat, the tip positioned precisely at a gap in his armor. Yield, she said simply. Thaklan stared up at her in shock. In 3 minutes of combat, this small human had done what entire armies had failed to accomplish. She had defeated a Kethvar war prime without taking a single hit. Ow, he whispered. Santos helped him to his feet with surprising gentleness. Training, strategy, and the fact that size isn't everything. Your species has relied on physical superiority for so long that you've forgotten how to actually fight. The silence that followed was absolute. Across the gathered fleet, representatives from 16 other species watched their displays in stunned disbelief. The Kethvar were legendary warriors. Their empire spanned dozens of systems, built on the backs of conquered enemies. Yet their greatest champion had been defeated by a human with a stick. Admiral Chen's voice broke the silence. Who would like to go next? Zeftar found himself making detailed notes for the first time in centuries. This wasn't going according to any predictable pattern. His analysis subroutines were generating error codes as they tried to process what he had just witnessed. A primitive species from a death world shouldn't have been capable of such tactical sophistication. The Luminari were the next to step forward. Unlike the Kethvar, they were a species of pure energy beings who had mastered the manipulation of light and electromagnetic forces. Their champion, radiant singer Velthara, appeared as a shifting pattern of golden light contained within a crystalline framework. "We do not rely on crude, physical strength," Velthara announced, her voice resonating across multiple frequencies. "Let us see how your champion fares against the power of stars themselves." The human representative this time was different, a man named David Kim who wore what appeared to be a reflective suit covered in mirrors and metallic surfaces. His weapon was even more unusual, a collection of small devices that he began placing around the combat area before the match began. "What is he doing?" demanded the Void Hunter representative, Captain S.S. Thek. Admiral Chin's response was cheerful. "Preparing. David's specialty is dealing with energy-based opponents. Should be quite the show." As soon as the match began, Velthara unleashed a barrage of coherent light beams that would have vaporized most organic matter instantly. The beams struck Kim's suit and scattered in all directions, reflecting off the mirrored surfaces in complex patterns. But rather than random reflections, the scattered light seemed to be following a deliberate path, bouncing between the devices he had placed around the arena. "Impossible," whispered the Luminari observer. "He's using our own attacks to create a containment pattern." Kim moved with the same fluid grace that Santos had displayed, but his style was completely different. Where she had been a dancer, he was an engineer. Every step, every positioning of his body and equipment served a specific purpose in the growing web of reflected energy that now surrounded both fighters. Velthara increased her output, pouring more power into her attacks. The arena blazed with enough energy to power a small city. But each additional beam only strengthened Kim's containment grid. The Luminari champion was literally creating the cage that would contain her. "You're quite powerful," Kim called out conversationally as he dodged another salvo. "But you're thinking about this all wrong. You're treating light like a weapon when it's actually a tool." With a gesture, Kim triggered his devices. The web of reflected energy collapsed inward, creating a perfect mirror sphere around Velthara. Her own power, turned back on itself, created a prison of pure light that she couldn't escape without destroying herself. "Yield," Kim asked politely. The crystalline framework containing Velthara's essence dimmed as she powered down her weapons. "I yield. Your mastery of optical physics is impressive for a primitive species." Kim began collecting his equipment with practiced efficiency. "Thanks. Though I should mention, I'm not a physicist. I'm a lighting technician for Broadway shows. This is actually much easier than trying to get the illumination right for Act 2 of Hamilton." Once again, the assembled fleet found itself in stunned silence. Two champions defeated, and the humans had made it look effortless. Worse yet, their representatives seemed to be treating the entire affair as a casual exercise rather than a desperate struggle for survival. Zeftar's preliminary report was already running longer than most of his civilization analyses. This was unprecedented in the Council's records. Species that had just achieved interstellar flight weren't supposed to possess such tactical sophistication. They weren't supposed to have champions who could defeat galactic-class warriors with apparent ease. The pattern that was emerging worried him more than he cared to admit. The humans weren't winning through superior technology or overwhelming force. They were winning through adaptation, innovation, and a type of strategic thinking that seemed completely alien to the established galactic powers. As the fleet representatives began discussing their next moves, Zeftar found himself wondering if perhaps the galaxy's established civilizations had become too comfortable in their superiority. They had grown used to winning through the same methods that had served them for millennia: raw power, advanced technology, or natural advantages. But the humans were fighting differently. They were treating each opponent as a puzzle to be solved rather than an enemy to be overpowered. They studied weaknesses, adapted tactics, and used their opponent's own strengths against them. It was a type of warfare that the galaxy had forgotten existed. Admiral Chin's voice interrupted his thoughts. "We have time for one more match today. Any other volunteers?" The silence stretched for long minutes before Captain S.S. Thek of the Void Hunters transmitted his response. "We will face your next champion. But know this, humans, My species has perfected the art of killing. We do not rely on strength or energy. We are death itself. Chin's response carried a note of genuine interest. Oh, that's perfect. Our next champion specializes in exactly that sort of opponent. I think you two are going to have a fascinating conversation. Captain SS Thek materialized on the asteroid's surface like a shadow given form. The Void Hunters were masters of stealth and assassination, their bodies naturally adapted for perfect camouflage. Standing nearly 2 meters tall, SS Thek's form seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it, creating a disconcerting void in the shape of a humanoid figure. His species had eliminated entire civilizations without ever being detected, striking from the darkness and vanishing before their victims could mount a defense. The human champion who stepped forward to meet him was perhaps the most unremarkable individual Zeftar had yet observed. Thomas Mitchell appeared to be a middle-aged human male of average height and build, wearing standard military fatigues with no visible armor or weapons. His only equipment was a small backpack and what looked like a standard military field kit. "This is your champion against the Void Hunters?" SS Thek's voice seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. A soldier with no weapons facing a master assassin? Even by human standards, this seems inadequate. Mitchell shrugged, his demeanor completely relaxed. Tom Mitchell, Sergeant First Class, U.S. Army Rangers. Been looking forward to this one. Actually, haven't had a decent hunt in months. The casual way he said hunt sent a chill through Zeftar's translator circuits. The human wasn't talking about being hunted. He was talking about hunting the Void Hunter. SS Thek's laugh was like wind through a graveyard. You misunderstand the situation, human. You are not the predator here. You are prey. Yeah, that's what the last guy said, Mitchell replied, unpacking his field kit with methodical precision. Taliban fighter, real piece of work. Thought he was hot stuff because he could disappear into the mountains. Took me 3 days to track him down. Zeftar watched in fascination as Mitchell began laying out items from his pack. Small electronic devices, lengths of wire, what appeared to be simple tools and materials. Nothing that looked particularly threatening, yet the way he handled each item spoke of intimate familiarity and deadly purpose. You have 3 minutes to prepare yourself, SS Thek announced. Then, I will demonstrate why my species has never failed an elimination contract. Mitchell glanced up from his preparations. Appreciate the time. Though I should mention, the clock starts when you attack, not when you say it does. With those words, the human soldier seemed to vanish. Not in the dramatic way that SS Thek could bend light and shadow around himself, but through something far more mundane and somehow more terrifying. He simply stepped behind a rock outcropping and disappeared from view as completely as if he had never existed. SS Thek's confidence wavered for the first time. His species' enhanced senses could track movement across vast distances, detect heartbeats through solid rock, and follow scent trails days old. Yet he could find no trace of the human. It was as if Mitchell had simply ceased to exist. Impossible, SS Thek muttered, extending his sensory apparatus to maximum range. The asteroid was small enough that there were no true hiding places, nowhere a human could concealment himself from Void Hunter tracking abilities. Yet Mitchell was simply gone. The attack came from directly behind him, the one direction that should have been impossible. Mitchell materialized out of empty air, moving with the fluid grace of a predator in his natural element. But instead of striking with a weapon, he simply tagged SS Thek on the shoulder with what appeared to be a small electronic device, then vanished again before the Void Hunter could react. What? SS Thek began, then looked down at the device now attached to his stealth suit. A simple motion detector, the kind used in primitive security systems. But the implications made his blood run cold. Problem with perfect camouflage. Mitchell's voice came from somewhere in the rocks, echoing in a way that made it impossible to locate, is that it only works if you stay perfectly still. Move at all, and you create a disturbance. Temperature differential, displaced air, compression of soil under your feet. A dozen things that basic field sensors can pick up. SS Thek spun toward the voice, his natural weapons extending. razor-sharp claws that could cut through starship hull plating. But Mitchell was no longer there. More importantly, the motion detector on SS Thek's shoulder was now beeping rapidly, broadcasting his position to whatever other sensors the human had deployed. Your species has become too dependent on your natural advantages, Mitchell continued, his voice now coming from a completely different direction. Don't get me wrong. Active camouflage is impressive tech. But it's still tech. And all tech has weaknesses. Another device landed near SS Thek's feet, this one producing a soft infrared glow visible only to sensors. The Void Hunter realized with growing horror that he was being marked, tagged like an animal for slaughter. Every movement he made added to the sensor network tracking him. Show yourself, SS Thek snarled, abandoning stealth in favor of speed. He burst into motion, covering ground with inhuman velocity as he searched for his tormentor. Already am showing myself, Mitchell replied calmly. You're just looking for the wrong thing. This time SS Thek caught a glimpse of movement. Not the human himself, but a small disturbance in the dust near a cluster of rocks. He pounced on the location with lethal precision, claws extended to eviscerate his target. Instead, he found himself staring at another motion detector, this one rigged to a small mirror that had created the illusion of movement. Basic field craft, Mitchell's voice observed. Misdirection, false signatures, and patience. Amazing how effective simple techniques can be when everyone's expecting high-tech solutions. The psychological warfare was beginning to tell. SS Thek found himself jumping at shadows, attacking sensor decoys, and growing increasingly frustrated with his inability to locate an enemy who should have been helpless against Void Hunter capabilities. Worse yet, he was beginning to realize that every move he made was being anticipated, predicted, and countered by an opponent who seemed to understand his species' hunting methods better than he did himself. Your people have eliminated entire civilizations, Mitchell noted conversationally. Impressive kill count. But here's the thing about assassination. It only works when your targets don't know you're coming. What happens when someone's ready for you? When they've studied your methods and prepared countermeasures. When they're hunting you while you think you're hunting them. The answer came in the form of a simple rope snare that caught SS Thek's ankle as he moved between cover positions. The Void Hunter went down hard, his perfect balance disrupted by the most primitive of traps. Before he could recover, Mitchell was there, not attacking, but simply placing the muzzle of his sidearm against the back of SS Thek's head. Bang, the human said quietly. You're dead. SS Thek froze completely. In his species' culture, the act of allowing an enemy to achieve killing position was the ultimate defeat. But, more than that, he was genuinely stunned by how completely he had been outmaneuvered. Ow, he whispered. Mitchell helped him to his feet, showing the same respect that Santos had demonstrated. 23 years in the Army. 12 deployments to places where the other guy knew the terrain better, had better equipment, and wanted to kill me more than I wanted to kill him. You learn things. Like how movement patterns create predictable behaviors. How to use an enemy's advantages against them. How to turn a hunt into an ambush. The human began collecting his sensors and equipment with practiced efficiency. Your species is good at what they do, he continued. Real good. But you've never had to adapt. You've always been the apex predators. Problem is, Earth doesn't have apex predators. On Earth, everything is food for something else. Makes you think differently about survival. Zeftar watched the exchange with growing amazement. 3 champions defeated, and each victory had followed the same pattern. The humans didn't overpower their opponents or rely on superior technology. Instead, they adapted to each challenge, turning their enemies' greatest strengths into vulnerabilities. The psychological impact on the assembled fleet was becoming obvious. Representatives who had arrived expecting to witness humanity's submission were now engaged in heated discussions about tactics, strategy, and the possibility that they had seriously underestimated their opponents. Admiral Chen's voice cut through the chaos with cheerful efficiency. Well, that was educational. Who's next? This time the response was immediate. The Crystalline Hive's Queen Mind transmitted directly to all vessels simultaneously, her mental voice carrying the weight of 1 billion connected consciousnesses. Enough. We have observed your primitive tactics. Individual combat is meaningless. We are unity. We are perfection. Your champions cannot face the power of a coordinated collective. Admiral Chen's pause was thoughtful. Interesting point. Individual tactics versus collective action. I think we have just the champion for that challenge. The human representative who stepped forward this time was different from the others. Dr. Elena Vasquez appeared to be a civilian. No military bearing, no obvious weapons or equipment. She carried what looked like a standard tablet computer and wore a simple jumpsuit with various patches and insignia that meant nothing to most galactic observers. Dr. Elena Vasquez, she introduced herself. I'm emergency coordinator for the International Red Cross. I understand you want to demonstrate the power of collective action. The Crystalline Hive's response was a display of absolute coordination. 50 drones materialized on the asteroid surface, each one a perfect crystal construct linked to the Queen Mind's consciousness. They moved as a single entity, their actions perfectly synchronized and mutually supporting. When one drone attacked, the others provided covering fire. When one was threatened, the others repositioned to protect it. Vasquez watched the demonstration with professional interest, making notes on her tablet. Impressive coordination, she called out. How do you handle information processing with that many units? Must be quite a computational load. We are perfection, the Queen Mind replied through her drones. Each unit processes optimally. Each decision is immediately shared. We have no weakness. Vasquez mused, still typing. See, that's interesting because I deal with large-scale coordination problems all the time. Disaster relief, refugee management, complex emergencies where thousands of people need to work together under impossible conditions. And I've learned something important about collective action. The drones began their attack in perfect formation, energy weapons firing in precise patterns that should have overwhelmed any individual opponent. But Vasquez didn't try to dodge or fight. Instead, she activated her tablet and began broadcasting a signal. The thing about perfect coordination, she continued conversationally as crystal weapons fire scorched the ground around her, is that it requires perfect information flow. Every unit needs to know what every other unit is doing, right? The broadcast from her tablet was simple, a rapid series of status updates, position reports, and tactical information, all formatted to match the Crystalline Hive's communication protocols. To anyone listening, it sounded exactly like the kind of coordination data the drones used to maintain their perfect unity. The effect was immediate and devastating. The drones began responding to false information, repositioning to counter threats that didn't exist, providing support to units that weren't actually endangered. Their perfect coordination became perfect chaos as they tried to process contradictory data streams. The military has a name for this, Vasquez noted as crystal drones began colliding with each other in their confusion. Electronic warfare. But in disaster relief, we call it something else, information management. When you're coordinating thousands of relief workers across multiple time zones, you learn that too much information can be worse than too little. The Queen Mind's mental shriek of frustration was audible across the entire fleet as her drones attempted to sort reality from deception. Some froze completely as their processing systems locked up, trying to resolve contradictory inputs. Others began attacking each other, responding to false threat assessments. Cease your interference, the Queen Mind demanded. Can't do that, Vasquez replied, adding new data streams to her broadcast. See, perfect unity assumes perfect information. But information warfare has been around since humans started talking to each other. We've had thousands of years to get good at it. Within minutes, the 50 drones had reduced themselves to a handful of functional units, the rest disabled by their own confusion or fratricidal fire. The remaining drones huddled together, tried to establish a clean communication channel free from Vasquez's interference. Enough, the Queen Mind transmitted. We acknowledge defeat. Vasquez powered down her tablet with a satisfied expression. Thanks for the interesting challenge. You might want to work on communication security protocols. Maybe some encryption, identity verification, that sort of thing. happy to send you some white papers on the subject. The silence that followed was different from the previous occasions. This time, Zeftar could sense genuine fear among the assembled fleet representatives. For different combat philosophies had been countered with casual efficiency. The humans weren't just winning. They were demonstrating a depth of tactical knowledge that suggested they had been preparing for this type of conflict far longer than anyone had imagined. Admiral Chen's next transmission carried a note of finality. We have 3 more champions standing by if anyone else would like to test themselves. But I should warn you, things are about to get significantly more challenging. For the first time since the contest had begun, no one volunteered. The representatives were finally beginning to understand what Zeftar had suspected from the beginning. They weren't facing primitives with delusions of grandeur. They were facing a species that had turned survival into an art form, war into a science, and adaptation into an instinct. The humans had been testing the galaxy's finest, and the galaxy's finest had been found wanting. The extended silence following Dr. Vasquez's victory stretched across the assembled fleet like a physical weight. Zeftar watched his instruments carefully, noting the increased electromagnetic activity from various ships as their crews engaged in heated discussions. The original confident chatter between vessels had been replaced by tense, private communications. Finally, a new voice entered the dialogue. High Arbitrator Kelthon of the Geometric Imperium had remained silent throughout the previous contests, but his species commanded respect throughout the galaxy. The Geometrics were pure logic beings, mathematical entities that had achieved physical form through will and calculation alone. Their empire was built on absolute rational principles, and their military forces operated with mechanical precision. These contests have been educational, Kelthon transmitted, his voice carrying the weight of computed certainty. However, the previous challenges have relied on physical prowess, energy manipulation, stealth, and coordination, all factors subject to variables and unpredictable elements. Logic, however, is absolute. Mathematics does not lie. Strategic superiority through calculated probability cannot be defeated by primitive cunning. Admiral Chen's response carried genuine interest. A logic-based challenge? That's perfect. Our next champion specializes in exactly that type of problem. The human who stepped forward appeared to be the youngest yet. A woman who looked barely out of adolescence, wearing what appeared to be casual civilian clothing and thick-rimmed glasses. Her only equipment was a worn laptop computer that looked ancient by galactic standards. Jennifer Wu. She introduced herself with a slight bow. MIT graduate student, double major in theoretical mathematics and applied game theory. Currently working on my doctoral thesis in strategic decision algorithms. Kelthon's form, a shifting pattern of geometric shapes that somehow conveyed living intelligence, rotated through several configurations as he processed this information. A student. The humans send a student to face the strategic might of the Geometric Imperium. Well, technically I'm ABD, all but dissertation, Wu replied cheerfully, setting up her laptop on a convenient rock. But I've been running strategic simulations since I was 12. This should be fun. The geometric champion materialized as a perfect dodecahedron, each face displaying complex mathematical formulas that shifted and evolved in real time. This was no physical combat. Kelthon was proposing something far more sophisticated. We shall engage in strategic warfare through logical simulation, he announced. I will present you with a series of tactical scenarios. Each scenario will involve resource allocation, force positioning, and probability calculations. Victory conditions will be mathematically determined based on optimal decision-making algorithms. Primitive intuition cannot defeat logical certainty. Wu's laptop screen flickered to life, displaying what appeared to be a crude tactical interface. Sound great. What's the first scenario? The holographic display that materialized between them showed a complex star system with multiple planets, asteroid fields, and strategic resources. Fleet positions were marked in 3 dimensions, with probability clouds indicating possible enemy movements and engagement zones calculated down to decimal points. Scenario 1, Kelthon announced. Two fleets of equal composition engage in contested space. Optimal positioning yields 73.6% probability of victory for the force controlling the high orbital position around the fourth planet. Calculate your moves. Wu studied the display for about 30 seconds, then began typing rapidly. Okay, but you're making some assumptions that don't hold up under real-world conditions. Explain, Kelthon demanded, his geometric form rotating faster as his processors engaged. Well, you're treating this like a chess problem. Perfect information, rational actors, predetermined move sets. But actual warfare doesn't work that way. Wu's fingers danced across her keyboard as she manipulated the display. What happens if I introduce uncertainty variables? The tactical display suddenly became chaotic. Wu had added random event generators, equipment failures, communication delays, human error factors, and environmental hazards. The clean probability calculations that Kelthon had generated began producing wildly different outcomes with each iteration. These variables are irrelevant, Kelthon protested. Proper strategic planning accounts for mechanical reliability and trained personnel performance. Does it? Wu asked innocently, adding more chaos factors to the simulation. What about combat stress affecting decision-making speed? Fatigue, compromising judgment after extended operations? The psychological impact of casualties on unit cohesion? Supply chain disruptions due to enemy action? Each new variable Wu introduced sent cascading changes through the strategic simulation. Kelthon's perfect mathematical certainties crumbled as real-world complexity overwhelmed his logical models. Furthermore, Wu continued, warming to her subject, you're assuming both sides will make rational decisions based on optimal outcomes. But humans don't work that way. Sometimes we do things because they're right, not because they're logical. She highlighted a section of the display where one of her fleet elements was moving directly into a disadvantageous position. See this destroyer squadron? According to your calculations, they're making a tactically suicidal charge. No rational commander would order it. Correct, Kelthon agreed, his form stabilizing as he returned to logical ground. The mathematical probability of mission success is less than 3%. No logical being would attempt such an operation. But what if that destroyer squadron is buying time for a civilian evacuation? Wu asked. What if those 12 ships can hold the line just long enough for 100,000 refugees to reach safety? What if the crews volunteered for the mission knowing they probably won't come back? The simulation shifted again as Wu added new parameters, civilian populations, moral imperatives, and the willingness of humans to sacrifice tactical advantage for ethical principles. Kelthon's logical frameworks began generating error cascades as they tried to process decisions that made no mathematical sense. This is illogical. Kelthon struggled to compute the new variables. Self-sacrifice for non-optimal outcomes serves no strategic purpose, doesn't it? Wu challenged. What happens to the morale of the remaining fleet when they see 12 destroyer crews die to save civilians? What happens to the enemy's psychological state when they realize they're fighting people who value principles more than survival? How do you calculate the strategic impact of inspiration, determination, and fighting for something bigger than yourself? Zeftar watched in fascination as the most advanced strategic computer in the galaxy struggled with concepts that any human child could understand. The geometric Imperium had built their entire civilization on logical principles, but they had never encountered a species that could be simultaneously logical and illogical, strategic and emotional, calculated and passionate. Wu introduced more scenarios, each one adding layers of complexity that pushed Kelthon's processing beyond his limits. Guerrilla warfare, where the mathematically weaker side refused to accept defeat. Diplomatic solutions that turned enemies into allies through negotiation rather than conquest. Economic warfare, where victory was achieved by making conflict too expensive to continue. Your calculations assume that victory means defeating the enemy, Wu pointed out. But what if victory means convincing them to stop fighting? What if the optimal outcome is achieved through methods or logical frameworks can't even recognize as warfare? Kelthon's form began to flicker as his processing systems overloaded. These scenarios, they do not compute. The variables are infinite. The logical chains become recursive. How do you function with such uncertainty? Wu closed her laptop with a satisfied click. Practice, I guess. Humans have been dealing with uncertainty since we figured out that saber-toothed tigers were scary. We got good at making decisions with incomplete information, adapting when our plans fell apart, and finding creative solutions to impossible problems. But how do you achieve victory without logical certainty? Kelthon asked, his voice carrying genuine confusion. Who says we need logical certainty? Wu replied, sometimes the best strategy is to be unpredictable. Sometimes you win by changing the rules of the game. Sometimes victory looks like something nobody expected. The high arbitrator of the geometric imperium, master of strategic logic and mathematical warfare, formally transmitted his surrender. I acknowledge defeat. Your strategic methodology is incomprehensible but demonstrably effective. Once again, Admiral Chin's voice filled the silence. Anyone else interested in testing themselves against our champions? This time the pause was even longer. 5 different combat methodologies had been systematically dismantled by human champions who seemed to treat the entire affair as an interesting intellectual exercise. The galaxy's established powers were finally beginning to understand the true scope of what they faced. It was the psionic collective that broke the silence, their mental voice carrying the weight of 1,000 linked minds speaking in perfect unison. We have observed these contests with great interest. Physical strength, energy manipulation, stealth, coordination, and logic all have fallen to human adaptability. But there is one realm where adaptation is meaningless. The mind is absolute. Consciousness cannot be countered by tactical innovation. Admiral Chin's response carried a note of anticipation. Mental combat? Fascinating. Our next champion has been hoping someone would propose that type of challenge. The human who stepped forward was perhaps the most ordinary-looking yet. Dr. Robert Hayes appeared to be a middle-aged academic, wearing a rumpled suit and carrying a battered briefcase. His only distinguishing feature was a slight smile that never seemed to leave his face. Dr. Robert Hayes. He introduced himself to the assembled psionic collective representatives. Professor of cognitive psychology at Stanford University, specializing in consciousness studies and mental resilience training. I understand you'd like to explore the landscape of the mind. The psionic champion who materialized was unlike any of the previous opponents. The entity appeared as pure thought given form, a shifting pattern of light and shadow that existed primarily in mental space rather than physical reality. This was Void Thought Zenakar, one of the collective's most powerful consciousness manipulators. Human, Zenakar's mental voice resonated directly in the minds of all observers. Your species' tactical innovations are impressive, but irrelevant to mental combat. Consciousness is absolute. Thought cannot be deceived or misdirected. The mind is truth. Dr. Hayes chuckled softly, opening his briefcase to reveal a collection of what appear to be children's toys, picture books, puzzles, and simple games. That's an interesting perspective. Mind if I share a different viewpoint? Proceed, Zenakar commanded, his mental presence pressing against the consciousness of everyone present. Demonstrate the futility of resisting absolute mental power. Hayes held up a simple children's book, the kind used to teach basic reading skills. Tell me what you see when you look at this. The psionic entity's attention focused on the book with crushing intensity. I perceive printed symbols arranged in patterns to convey information. Primitive communication methodology. Exactly, Hayes agreed. You see words. But when I look at the same book, I see something completely different. He opened to a page showing a simple illustration of a rabbit in a garden. I see my daughter's first attempts at reading. Her frustration when she couldn't sound out difficult words. Her triumph when she finished her first complete sentence. I see bedtime stories, and the way her eyes lit up when she discovered that these marks on paper could transport her to magical worlds. Zinakar's mental presence wavered slightly. Emotional associations are irrelevant. Objective reality, is there such a thing? Hayes interrupted gently. You see objective reality when you look at this book. I see personal meaning. Which one of us is right? The human professor continued pulling items from his briefcase, each one accompanied by a story that transformed a simple object into something rich with personal significance. A worn baseball glove became a connection across generations between fathers and sons. A child's drawing, crude and imperfect, became a masterpiece of love and innocence. Cease this irrelevant narrative, Zinakar demanded, but his mental voice carried less certainty than before. Consciousness is objective. Truth is absolute. Is it? Hayes asked, now holding a simple photograph of a sunset. What truth do you see in this image? Electromagnetic radiation at specific wavelengths reflecting OFF atmospheric particles TO create visible light patterns, Zinakar replied immediately. Hayes nodded approvingly. Scientifically accurate. But here's what I see. The last sunset my father watched before he died. We sat together on the hospital balcony, neither of us talking because there was nothing left to say. But for just a few minutes, watching those colors paint the sky, everything was perfect. The effect on Zinakar was immediate and devastating. The psionic entity's perfect, objective consciousness began fracturing as it tried to process the emotional weight of human experience. Each story Hayes told added layers of subjective meaning that couldn't be reduced to simple facts or logical frameworks. Your species sees consciousness as pure thought, Hayes explained, his voice remaining gentle despite the mental chaos he was creating. But human consciousness isn't pure. It's messy, contradictory, full of meaning that makes no logical sense. We don't just think, we feel, remember, hope, dream, and love. Our minds aren't perfect, but they're real in ways that pure thought can never be. Zinakar's mental form began to flicker as his consciousness struggled with concepts that had no place in the psionic collective's understanding of mental reality. How do you process the absolute truth of a parent's love? How do you logically analyze the meaning of sacrifice, friendship, or the way a piece of music can carry someone back to a moment decades in the past? Stop, Zinakar pleaded, his mental voice now carrying harmonics of confusion and something approaching pain. These contradictions, they do not resolve. Consciousness cannot contain such inconsistencies. Sure it can, Hayes replied, closing his briefcase with the same gentle smile he'd worn throughout the encounter. Human consciousness does it every day. We hold contradictory ideas, impossible emotions, and meaningless meanings all at the same time. It doesn't make logical sense, but it makes human sense. The withdrawal of Zinakar's mental presence was abrupt and complete, leaving behind only a simple message. We yield. Your consciousness is incomprehensible. Dr. Hayes gave a small bow to the empty air where the psionic champion had been. Thank you for the interesting challenge. I hope you learned something useful about the nature of consciousness. 6 challenges, 6 defeats. The assembled fleet now faced a reality that none of them had been prepared to accept. Humanity's champions hadn't just won their contests. They had demonstrated a fundamental understanding of conflict, strategy, and existence itself that the galaxy's established powers had never even considered. Admiral Chen's voice, when it came, carried a weight of finality. We have exactly one more champion standing by. I don't suppose anyone else would like to volunteer for the honor. The silence stretched across space itself, broken only by the growing number of ships beginning to power down their weapon systems and initiate retreat protocols. Zeftar found himself faced with a report that would challenge everything the Galactic Observation Council thought they knew about warfare, consciousness, and the nature of sentient species. The humans hadn't just won. They had redefined what victory meant. The extended silence following Dr. Hayes' victory carried a weight that seemed to press against the hulls of the assembled ships. Zeftar watched his instruments record the growing number of vessels beginning to initiate departure protocols. Their representatives finally, understanding that this contest had revealed something far more significant than anyone had anticipated. It was then that a new transmission cut through the cosmic quiet, one that sent shock waves through every ship in the gathered fleet. The signal originated from beyond the outer rim of the Sol system, and its source signature was immediately recognizable to anyone who had studied galactic military history. Warfleet Dominator Crackstall of the Berserker Horde had arrived. So, the voice that had terrified 100-star systems rumbled across the fleet communications. The galaxy's weaklings have gathered to test themselves against primitive humans. And, from what my sensors tell me, the primitives are winning. Zeftar's tentacles trembled as he processed the implications. The Berserker Horde was different from every other civilization that had answered humanity's challenge. They weren't sophisticated tacticians, energy beings, or strategic computers. They were pure, distilled violence. A species that had evolved from predators so efficient that they had consumed their own homeworld's ecosystem before taking their hunger to the stars. Crackstall's flagship emerged from hyperspace like a mechanical nightmare given form. The vessel was less starship than flying weapon. Kilometers of armor plating studded with enough firepower to reduce planets to asteroids. Behind it came a formation that represented the accumulated military might of 3,000 conquered systems. Humans, Crackstall's transmission boomed across every frequency simultaneously. I have monitored your contests with great amusement. Clever tactics, adaptive strategies, psychological warfare, all very impressive against civilized species. But you have yet to face true savagery. You have yet to encounter an opponent that cannot be reasoned with, misdirected, or confused. Admiral Chen's response carried the same calm professionalism she had maintained throughout the previous challenges, but Zeftar detected an undertone of something else. Not fear, but anticipation. Va Fleet Dominator Coxtool, your reputation precedes you. I take it you're volunteering to test yourself against our final champion? Champion? Crackstall's laugh was like the sound of starships being torn apart. I do not send champions to face primitives. I come myself. I bring my personal guard, my elite warriors, my ship's full complement of berserkers. You wanted to show the galaxy what human champions could do? Then, show us how they die. The asteroid, designated as the fighting ground suddenly, seemed inadequate for what was being proposed. Crackstall wasn't suggesting individual combat. He was proposing something approaching actual warfare. How many opponents are you bringing? Chun inquired with professional interest. 500 of my finest killers, Crackstall replied. Warriors who have bathed in the blood of 1,000 species. Berserkers who know only victory and death. Face them with your champions, if you dare. Admiral Chen's pause was thoughtful. 500 seasoned warriors against our champions. That seems a bit unfair. Finally, Crackstall roared, a human who understands the reality of your situation will send 7 champions to make it more balanced, Chen finished calmly. The silence that followed was so complete that Zeftar checked his communication systems twice to ensure they were still functioning. 7 humans against 500 Berserker Horde elites. Even by the impossible standards set by the previous contests, the odds seemed genuinely suicidal. Crackstall's response carried genuine confusion. 7 against 500? Human, perhaps your translation systems are malfunctioning. I said 500 warriors. I heard you correctly, Chen replied. 7 human champions against your 500 finest. Should we make it more challenging somehow? The human dropship that descended toward the asteroid was a utilitarian craft that looked crude compared to the sleek vessels of other galactic powers. It disgorged 7 figures in standard military gear. No special armor, no obvious weapons beyond personal sidearms, no technological advantages that might explain their commander's confidence. Zeftar enhanced his sensors to maximum resolution as he studied the human champions. They moved with the easy coordination of a team that had worked together extensively, but they appear to be nothing more than standard human military personnel. Their leader, identified as Captain Marcus Rodriguez of the United States Marine Corps, carried himself with quiet confidence as he surveyed the terrain where the battle would take place. The Berserker forces that materialized on the asteroid's surface were everything their reputation suggested. Each warrior stood over 2 meters tall, encased in power armor that had been forged from the remains of conquered enemies. Their weapons were brutal, efficient killing tools designed for close combat, where their natural ferocity would be most effective. They moved in perfect formation, but it was the coordination of a pack rather than a military unit. Humans, Craxthull's voice boomed from the ranks of his warriors. You face the ultimate expression of warfare. No tactics will save you. No strategies will preserve your lives. We are death incarnate. Captain Rodriguez nodded respectfully. Marcus Rodriguez, Force Reconnaissance, United States Marine Corps. We understand you'd like to test your combat effectiveness against human forces. Combat effectiveness. Craxthull's laugh echoed across the asteroid. We do not test, human. We conquer. We destroy. His words were cut short as Rodriguez made a simple gesture to his team. The 7 humans spread out in what appeared to be a standard defensive formation, but something in their movement patterns triggered alarms in Zeftar's tactical analysis systems. These weren't random positions. They were carefully calculated firing positions that created interlocking fields of coverage across the entire battlefield. Before we begin, Rodriguez called out conversationally, I should mention that my team specializes in asymmetric warfare. We've had extensive experience dealing with numerically superior forces. The first wave of Berserker warriors charged with the fury of a cosmic storm, their battle cries echoing across the asteroid surface. They moved with inhuman speed and coordination, weapons raised to tear apart the small group of humans who dare to stand against them. The humans opened fire. What followed challenged everything Zeftar thought he understood about infantry combat. The 7 human champions didn't simply shoot. They created a symphony of destruction that turned the asteroid's surface into a carefully orchestrated killing field. Each Marine knew exactly where his teammates were aiming, creating gaps in their fire patterns that allowed for movement and repositioning while maintaining continuous pressure on the advancing Berserkers. Rodriguez moved through the chaos like a conductor directing a deadly orchestra. His commands were minimal, hand signals and brief phrases that triggered complex tactical maneuvers. The humans flowed around the battlefield like water, always in motion, never presenting static targets, but never breaking their coordinated fire patterns. The Berserker charge faltered as the front ranks were systematically eliminated with surgical precision. Each shot was placed with deadly accuracy, targeting weak points in armor or exploiting gaps in formation. But more than mere marksmanship, the humans demonstrated something that the galaxy's warriors had never encountered: the ability to fight as a single organism while maintaining individual tactical flexibility. Impossible! Craxthull snarled as his elite warriors found themselves unable to close with enemies who seemed to anticipate every move. Stand and fight like warriors. We are fighting like warriors, Rodriguez replied, his voice carrying clearly across the battlefield as he coordinated another tactical withdrawal that drew pursuing Berserkers into a crossfire. Marine warriors. And Marines don't fight fair, we fight to win. The second wave of Berserkers approached with more caution, having learned that direct charges were suicide against human fire discipline. They attempted to use cover, coordinate their advances, and apply tactical pressure to force the humans into defensive positions. It didn't work. The humans had transformed the asteroid into their domain, using every rock outcropping, every crater, every piece of terrain to their advantage. They moved through positions that had been prepared with military precision, preset firing points, fallback routes, and supply caches that suggested they had been planning for exactly this type of engagement. Your warriors are brave, Rodriguez acknowledged as his team executed another flawless tactical maneuver, but they're fighting the last war. They're using tactics designed for medieval combat. Charge the enemy, overpower them through superior force, achieve victory through brutality. A third wave of Berserkers attempted a more sophisticated approach, trying to surround the humans and attack from multiple directions simultaneously. The Marines simply shifted their formation, creating interlocking fields of fire that covered all approaches while maintaining their mobility. Modern warfare isn't about being the strongest or the most savage, Rodriguez continued. His team's weapons fired, never pausing as they engaged targets across a 360-degree battlefield. It's about intelligence, coordination, and the ability to adapt to changing conditions faster than your enemy can respond. Zeftar watched in growing amazement as the human tactics evolve in real time to counter each new berserker approach. When the aliens tried to use their superior armor to advance under fire, the humans switched to explosive rounds that targeted joints and weak points. When the berserkers attempted to use their numbers to overwhelm defensive positions, the humans abandoned those positions before they could be surrounded. But perhaps most terrifying of all was the human emotional state throughout the battle. They weren't fighting in berserker fury or savage desperation. They were calm, professional, almost businesslike in their approach to what should have been a desperate struggle for survival. "Stand still and die like warriors," Crackstall roared as his forces continued to take casualties without inflicting any meaningful damage on their human opponents. "That's not how Marines fight," Rodriguez replied, coordinating yet another tactical withdrawal that left a dozen berserker corpses in the humans' former positions. "We're not warriors, we're warfighters. There's a difference." The distinction became clear as the battle continued. The berserkers fought like individual warriors, each seeking personal glory and individual victory. The humans fought like a military unit, each member supporting the others, every action serving the greater tactical plan. When berserker forces finally managed to corner one of the human champions, they discovered that isolating a single Marine was not the victory they had expected. The trapped human, identified as Corporal Jennifer Park, didn't panic or attempt desperate heroics. Instead, she activated a device that marked her position and continued fighting with the calm professionalism of someone executing a predetermined plan. "Corporal Park is in position for Operation Thunderclap," Rodriguez announced to his team. "Execute on my mark." The explosion that followed vaporized a significant portion of the asteroid's surface along with 50 berserker warriors who had converged on what they thought was a vulnerable target. Park emerged from the crater unharmed, protected by equipment that had been positioned precisely to create a safe zone in the blast radius. "Shaped charges," Rodriguez explained conversationally to the shocked berserkers. "We call it danger close fire support." Corporal Park volunteered to be the bait, because she knew exactly where to position herself for maximum safety. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. The berserkers had spent thousands of years perfecting the art of savage warfare, but they had never faced enemies who could turn self-sacrifice into tactical victory, who could plan their own deaths in such detail that survival became inevitable. Crackstall's personal intervention in the battle was the final escalation. The Warfleet Dominator was a living weapon, genetically enhanced and cybernetically augmented to be the perfect predator. He stood 3 meters tall, moved within human speed, and carried weapons that could level buildings. He lasted exactly 37 seconds against Captain Rodriguez in single combat. The Marine officer didn't try to match Crackstall's strength or speed. Instead, he used the alien's own momentum against him, employed basic judo techniques that redirected force rather than opposing it, and applied combat training that had been developed through thousands of years of human warfare. When Crackstall charged with berserker fury, Rodriguez stepped aside and used a simple trip to send the massive alien crashing into a boulder. When the Warfleet Dominator attempted to use his superior reach and strength, Rodriguez moved inside his guard and applied joint locks that even cybernetic enhancement couldn't counter. "The thing about berserker rage," Rodriguez noted as he applied a chokehold that cut off blood flow to Crackstall's enhanced brain, "is that it makes you predictable. Angry opponents make mistakes. Furious enemies telegraph their attacks. Savage fighters abandon strategy for emotion." Crackstall's surrender was barely audible, transmitted through failing communication systems as his consciousness faded. How do you fight without fury? How do you kill without hatred?" Rodriguez released the chokehold and helped the fallen alien to his feet with the same respect his teammates had shown their defeated opponents. "We don't fight because we hate what's in front of us. We fight because we love what's behind us. The silence that followed the end of combat was absolute. 7 human champions stood among the scattered remnants of 500 elite berserker warriors, their equipment undamaged, their casualties non-existent, their victory so complete that it challenged fundamental assumptions about warfare itself. Admiral Chen's transmission reached the assembled fleet with quiet finality. I believe that concludes our demonstration. The question before you now is simple. Do you still wish to contest humanity's right to exist among the stars? The response was a cascade of surrender transmissions from every ship in the fleet. Not formal capitulation, but something far more significant: acknowledgement, recognition, the understanding that humanity represented something entirely new in galactic civilization. Zeftar began composing his report to the Galactic Observation Council, knowing that every word would be scrutinized by beings who would find his conclusions almost impossible to believe. How do you explain a species that treats warfare as a science rather than an art? How do you describe champions who fight without hatred, win without cruelty, and demonstrate mercy to enemies who showed them none? As the various fleets began their withdrawal from the Sol system, Zeftar found himself faced with a fundamental question that would reshape galactic civilization. What do you do when the newest member of the cosmic community is also the most dangerous? The humans had issued their challenge to prove they deserved a place among the stars. Instead, they had demonstrated that perhaps the stars needed them more than they needed the stars. In a galaxy grown complacent with established power structures and predictable conflicts, humanity represented something that had been missing for millennia: evolution. They were teachers disguised as students, showing ancient civilizations new ways to think about conflict, strategy, and existence itself. Every victory had been a lesson, every contest a demonstration that there were always alternative approaches to seemingly insurmountable challenges. Zeftar's final observation, the one that would trouble the Council's sleep for decades to come, was perhaps the most important. The humans had sent their champions not to prove their strength, but to show mercy. They could have destroyed every ship in the gathered fleet, could have pursued retreating forces back to their home systems, could have used their demonstrated superiority to establish dominion over species that had challenged their right to exist. Instead, they had simply proven their point and offered friendship to their former enemies. The cosmos had feared them before understanding what they truly were. Now, perhaps it was time for the cosmos to learn from them instead, because in the end, that had been the real message behind humanity's challenge. Not a threat, but an invitation to become better than they had ever imagined possible. The age of human expansion into galactic civilization had begun not with conquest, but with education. And the galaxy would never be the same.